All right.
Would prefer to have the screen up on the video, so it'd be big enough for everyone to see if you could go and look at that as a reference. But unfortunately, that's as good as the Zoom gets on that particular recorder. If you want to go back and you need to refer, I'll put it up for this class also, but primarily I've recorded the things for the online classes. Now, everybody should have their draft back, except I think I just went back and I forgot to put Ms. Pafford's back in there, sorry. I'll get that done today, as I'm grading your essays. Most of them were pretty good. I mean, that's for y'all as well as the online class. There were a few who were very, very short. Put in like a paragraph, 2 paragraphs, something like that, where it was not really possible to go through and give you any kind of critique because there was just so much missing that the biggest part of the critique would just be, well, you got to go put all the stuff in there. So some of you got comments, something to the effect that this should be able to be submitted early. Right? You should have just a few revisions or a few additions, and that means you could probably spend like an hour or so, changing things around, putting some things in, or whatever, and just get it submitted, really within a day or so. Assuming you had read the whole book and you didn't have to go back and do some additions that way. Now, if you hadn't read the book, you still should have been able to get some of the critical elements in there. And just make sure we're on the same page when I use the word critical, in the sense that I'm using it for this discussion. It's not going to mean necessarily essential. It means those parts where you're providing some kind of critical analysis of the book that you read. This one, you'll see that I took the name off, so it's anonymous and everything. You probably recognize it if this was yours, but this was actually one of the ones that was pretty good. Not many major problems with it at all. You might see a few grammatical changes or something along the way in here. There were some issues with formatting that pretty much everyone had, and the main thing for those that were submitted and where an attempt, a legitimate attempt was made to finish the rough draft. The other comment that you're going to see commonly is something to the effect, go back into the guide and make sure that you have all the elements that it has in that guide included in the final paper. And what that means is you probably had something missing. You want to go back through the checklist and make sure you put it in there. Some of those were fairly common. One of the most common ones was, I think I only had maybe 4 or 5 people out of both classes who reviewed the sources at all. So make sure you include some analysis of the sources. Most people, got the author's credentials. It's probably one of the easier ones to get. But the rubric item, if you look at the title, should tell you what you got to do because it reads author and sources. It tells you for that box you need to review the author's credentials as well as do some analysis of the sources that he uses. Now, those two are put together for a reason because both of them go to the legitimacy of the work. You got something that's written from a person who is not a historian, not a recognized person in his field. It lowers the esteem with which you would give that book to some extent. Same thing if you go through and look at the sources, regardless of how well educated the person is. All his work is just a very few sources. He relies on like maybe 2, 3 books. They question the need to actually read this book because he's only got 2 or 3 sources. Why not just go read one of those? It probably covers the same thing. Okay. Go a little bit more in depth than that, though. You want to note whether or not he's or she is, taking existing secondary sources and just summarizing, whether they're providing original research, their own original research. If that's the case, you're going to see a lot of primary documents as well as secondary sources. You want to note that in your analysis too. Be critical of it. Not just saying that, you know, this is original, they got a lot of primary sources, or this is just a summation of existing research and all the sources are secondary sources. And that should also affect who you recommend the book to. I mean, if it's all secondary sources and it's not original research, that isn't necessarily saying that the work is a bad work. You might come out later and say this book is a summation of existing research, and that's a benefit to certain people. Like if you have just started college, your first history class, it's an introduction to the topic, you might want to go read something that just summarizes all the existing research so that you have a good general idea of that work. The best works, the ones that are original, are going to have a lot of primary stuff, but you're also going to see a balance. They're going to have a lot of secondary resources too. And that's because they're taking literally everything that's been written and everything that they can find on the topic, and they're producing something original, something that they're possibly comparing to some of the stuff that's already been written out there. Okay. Most common thing was the Chicago Manual Style. Make sure you get these correct. This is the very first example right here, a book with a single author, and for most people that's going to be what you are going to be using, at least for your own book. There may have been 3 people, I think, who had books that had multiple authors, so you come down to the second example. None of the books that were chosen had more than 3 authors. Pay attention to this because it gives you 2 examples. One is for the first note. The second example is for the bibliography. If you're doing footnotes, which one of those are you going to use? You go, if you're doing notes, you use the one that says notes. It's kind of like a little bit of common sense here. Don't go and put the bibliography if you're doing a note. Same thing if you're doing the reverse. Just make sure you pick the right one. You have to be exact. Notice for the first note here, you have a 1 period. Right? Depends on the note. You might have cited a website, for example, to put in the author's credentials. So your first quote from the book itself might be note 3, so instead of 1, it's going to be 3. Obviously, you want to put the notes in order. If you get it more exact, this should be a superscript. It should be the little one up at the top left corner on this. If you go back to the text, it'll be a small 1 or small 2 at the upper right, just kind of like an exponent in math. If you don't know how to do that, if you're using like Microsoft Word, just ask. We can show you how to use it. Figure it out, I'm sure. If you click on the help button in Word or whatever program you're using. Notice it's reversed. If you go to the first note, you put the author's name, first name, last name. In the bibliography, it's exactly the opposite. It's last name, comma, first name. Also notice the punctuation changes. For the notes, after the name, it's a comma. For bibliography, after the name, it's a period. Pay attention to the space also after that. If it's a comma, it's followed by 1 space. If it's a period, it should be followed by 2 spaces. Women's diaries as narrative in the 19th century, 19th century novel. Notice there's no punctuation after that. The information for the publisher and the publishing date is all in parentheses on the note. After the parentheses, you have a comma and a page number from which you got that particular piece of information. If you're doing quotes, obviously, you want to cite it. But if you get a particular piece of information in most research writing and you put it in your own words, you still want to source it or cite it. So you would paraphrase and put it in your own words. You still come down and you put a note down there. For the book review, you don't have to do that for stuff that comes from the book, because obviously it should be coming from the book. But if you get information from other sources and you paraphrase, you do. Most commonly you'll see that when you do the author's credentials and you go off usually to, I think most of y'all went to a website somewhere. When you go to that website, that's also provided down here. I think it's the last set of examples, second to the last set of examples. If you get it from a website, it's got a note form there. So if you quote from the website, obviously, you source it. But even if you listen, you got just put in your own words. You got this PhD from Harvard University. That's in your own words. You still have to put a period, a superscript with 1, 2, whatever the number is, and cite where you got that information from. It didn't come out of your own head, and very doubtful that the fact that somebody got their degree from some university comes out of your own head, unless you can show that your father was the one who wrote the book or something. Then you've still got to cite it. Another thing that was common here was on the bibliography, make sure you get the tabs correct. Notice it goes all the way to the left margin on the first line. When you go down, if there's a second line, you tab over on the second line. If you have a long one, it goes down 3 lines. Same thing, you still tab over all the lines except for the first one. Kind of the reverse of what you do when you write a paragraph. A paragraph, it hits the first line and all the others are on the margin. Bibliography, the first line's on the margin and all the other lines are tabbed over. There's not any difference on the right margin though, so tab over on the left margin on the second line and then run it all the way to the end. Third line, tab over. But just make sure you get that. Some of y'all, including the example that we have up here, deviated a little bit from it. This is mostly right. You don't have to put print on there though. That's not necessary. Most of the books are going to be assumed to be print. In fact, all the ones on the list, I don't know, did anyone use like an e-version? I think someone did. You did? I'll have to go see if I can dig up an example for that and post it separately.
Can I pretend it's print?
And then that depends too. If you use like a PDF, or it had the same page numbering as the actual print copy, you can get away with it just doing it like this. I think somebody in one of my classes, it might have been one of my US classes, used a Kindle version and it had no page numbers on it. So, also notice that the folks in the bibliography are italicized. Note that they are not italicized in the note or underlined. Somewhat odd. I think this is the 15th edition. I think they've got a 16th out. I think in the 16th they are italicized everywhere. Look down at since it was so common, look down at the websites. I've noticed again, this is for just general websites. If it's not in an online journal, it's in an online journal, that's a little different, but I don't think that was the case for anyone. Did anyone in here have an online journal that they emphasized? No, good. All right, this would be like a common one. You might find where the person works. You might go to that college's website and generally they're going to have like the faculty listed for the departments, and they'll have the biographies up there. Some of these people actually post their resumes or curriculum vitas, which is like the academic world's version of a resume. If that's the case, then it gives you proper format here. Typically, you want to list the author, and most of the time it's not going to have a name up there. So the author is the organization who puts out the website. It's the University of Georgia's website, and you're going to see University of Georgia as the author. The title of the website itself, notice title case in quotations. See University again because they were not just the author but also the host of the website. Then you have the URL in parentheses. You put the date that you accessed the website. So if you went on today, you would put accessed October 29th, 2013. Bibliography is pretty much the same information, except again that you have to indent the second in any subsequent lines. Let's take a look at this one. A lot of people had cover pages where they had titles up at the top. You don't need them for this. You can delete those. Proper format for the heading of a book review is just this, the bibliographical entry, right at the top. One space down, you start the text. You do not need a cover page. You do not need to put in, a centered heading. All that's not necessary. Typically, the book reviews are published in journals, just like any kind of, journal, media that does those reviews, like a newspaper. New York Times, well known for doing its book reviews. They're worried about space because space costs money. Rather than have that cover page and have an entire page devoted to, just the title of the book and who reviewed it, they'd rather sell an advertisement to cover that whole page. Right? So maximize space. If you're printing this out, there's no need to kill more trees than we have to. You're not, but still do the format, as it is. And I think it also tells you that in the guide itself. The only deviance from this is that you come here after the final period. Instead of stopping like you would on a normal bibliographic entry, you go after the last period and you type reviewed by and put your name in there in a period. Other than that, it's just a standard bibliographical entry. You still have to have a bibliography down at the bottom for most of you, because most people did use more than one source. If the book itself is the only source, you don't need this. Most people got their information on the author from a website. Once you have a second source, though, you need a bibliography. If you have a bibliography, you have to put everything in it, including the book itself, so you have to repeat it there. See if you did that. Notice you didn't have the print on the final bibliography, so that was actually more correct than one at the top. Other than that, the format is good here. You see you have the bibliography, you go right into the text. Mentions at the beginning, starts a discussion of the credentials. Author's name, which you already have, mentions that he is a professor and the emeritus professor of history and sociology. One thing that is missing there, though, is the school. We don't know what school he was actually teaching. He's an emeritus professor. I've been emeritus professor here. I might have taken his job when he retired. I don't know. Or might have been in Oxford. Might have been Harvard. Because that could be relevant to try to get that information in there. Mentioned that he wrote 2 previous books. He might, and some people did, put titles of the other books. You don't necessarily have to. If he's acknowledged as an expert in the field, you're reviewing this book, you're not reviewing his other books. You can just mention that he's written X number of books on this topic, or X number of books on this time period, or something of that nature. Some of the guys, I know you're doing Guns, Germs, and Steel, and you are. Some of the books are not written by historians. And that does not mean that they can't produce a good work of history or something relevant to history. That book has more of a scientific aspect to it. So if the guy's credentialed in a scientific field, that's perfectly fine. You do want some statement in there as to why, say a psychologist should be read if you're studying history there. So what is it about his book, or what is it about his research that is relevant to a historical study? Another common thing, this was in a few works, once you get into the text itself, the titles of the book should be italicized also, like they are in this one. This one does go out to some of the sources, some of the graphics that they put in. Mentions that the second paragraph gets right into the thesis though. Very important, and remember, if you read the guide, most of the discussion should be on how he develops his thesis. So it mentions that thesis right there in the first paragraph after the credentials. Notes that there are two divisions of it. Focuses on how individuals were affected and view of how that changed the larger landscape for presumably Europe. Notice there's some critique on here. The critiques the actual thesis itself, which is nice. I don't think it necessarily required that in the guide, but you can look at the thesis and the thesis itself. The whole point of the book might be something you're not interested in. In this case, it mentions that way of approaching it is actually beneficial to some readers. Engages the reader for a longer amount of time and express more of his own thoughts and opinions on the matter. So some explanation as to how it's beneficial. If there's any drawback on that one, it might not have explained to whom it would be more beneficial. Did an analysis area, including of the table of contents. Says that you can actually go through the table of contents and see that every chapter in effect supports the thesis. So that's again something you don't necessarily see a lot of, but if you're critiquing his organization, what's the first thing you want to go to see how the book is organized? Table of contents. How many go actually read books outside of school? If you buy nonfiction, what's the first thing you typically look at when you go in to Barnes & Noble and pick up a book, decide whether or not you want to buy it or not?
Cover.
The cover, okay. Well, that's good. Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I have a rule, it has to grab me in like the first 3 pages, and if it doesn't, then
Okay.
that way I can read 3 pages in the store.
I don't know, I get ebooks.
You get ebooks, okay. Cool. First thing I typically go to is and I, well, yeah, okay, the cover, true. But, you know, if the title looks like something that's going to be of interest to me, a lot of times the text doesn't necessarily back up what the title promises it's going to deliver. So I'll go to the table of contents and see what kind of subject matter they're really dealing with in there. A lot of things, if you're talking about the plague, for example, you could go in there and it could talk about just the social changes that came out because of the plague, or it could be a completely scientific analysis, medical history of the plague. So I'll look at the table of contents and see what it really covers.
Sometimes that can be misleading too, but it'll generally give you a better idea. Got one of the quotes in here, so that's good. Now one thing come down here, some people had the parentheticals. Notice in the guide, it doesn't give you a format for parenthetical citations. So make sure you get those into either a footnote or an endnote format for the last one. Now, if you put them in here, oops, sorry, wrong back. If you put them in here in the rough draft, that's not a big issue, because you know, perfectly fine if you just put the page number down there for your reference, so that you can go back later and make sure you develop that into a full citation in a footnote or endnote. In fact, when we were writing, when I was in college, and like we had to do like a master's thesis. Mine came up to be like about 112 pages, so we had a whole lot of
Whoa.
citations in there.
That's a lot.
Probably averaged about 2 citations a paragraph on that too. So a whole lot of citations.
What was it on?
It was on legal history of the
That is so boring.
land
I
rights
couldn't do
for these Native Americans in the Supreme Court. And yeah, thesis and dissertations are often have to be on obscure topics, so they're only of interest to people who study it. Sometimes they get developed into books, but now that 112 pages, probably about a good dozen of that was the bibliography itself. So about a 12-page bibliography. But about 100 pages of text or 98 pages of text. Two citations per paragraph, probably 2-3 paragraphs a page. So you can figure out it's a whole lot of footnotes in there.
Oh, yeah.
But as you're writing it, oftentimes you don't want to take a, break your train of thought and go down and do a footnote every time you quote something. So do the same thing. Put like a, like a little notation in there. Maybe the author and the page number. But then we go back and fix it later. So if that's what you're aiming at, that's perfectly fine. I know a lot of people are used to MLA here, ABA, APA. If you are, they use a lot of parentheticals, but CMH doesn't use a lot of parentheticals. There is a format for it, but nobody uses it really. So mostly you can go with the endnotes and stuff. Right. You notice the text goes on, let's see, how many pages do we have here? 6 pages altogether. Good. Right. First 2 paragraphs, having that analyzed or isolated the thesis, came down to the second paragraph, analyzed the table of contents, maybe looking at the organization a little bit, but still showing how it helps to develop the thesis. That's exactly what you want to do. The whole thing should be aimed at, does the guy do what he says he's going to do? All right. Very important word here, or phrase in this case. It says this person has a lot of subtle biases. The bias or the prejudice of the author is very important. You want to isolate that. Does that have an impact on how he writes the book? Most definitely. If you look at American history, the way they wrote about slavery, in the 1800s, versus how they write about it in the early 1900s, and compare that to the 1960s, compare that to now, the bias of the author in particular just dictates the whole thing. You don't even have to read a history book to see that. If you go, anyone ever seen Gone with the Wind? How is slavery portrayed in Gone with the Wind? Yeah, it's a good thing. Yeah, all these people are happy being slaves. Anyone buy that now? Anyone think that's an accurate portrayal now of how the slaves thought of slavery? No. Now, if you go look at what's the movie that came out last year? Django Unchained.
Oh, okay, there you go.
All right, a little bit of a different bias there, maybe by the guy who made that.
Did you see it?
All right, and a little bit different maybe in how slavery was portrayed. I didn't see that one, so I don't
Oh,
know. But
really?
I saw the reviews.
It's really good.
It was really funny.
It's funny, okay. Anyone see the Amistad?
What?
Roots, maybe? Roots, you did, okay.
Toby.
You know, different way of portraying slavery completely from Gone with the Wind, right? That's because part of it was society's bias, but in particular is the person's bias who made the film. Might not have been the actor's bias. Y'all know Clark Gable, the guy who was the star, what was his name, Rhett Butler? Made a real interesting movie, like not too long after that. It might have been like about 12 years later. Can't remember the title, but it was a completely different take on slavery. I think it had Sidney Poitier in it too. Played one of the slaves, but it starts off with like this girl who's growing up as the plantation owner's daughter in Kentucky. They send her off to school. She comes home when her father dies. Finds out that she was not. Her mother was actually one of the slaves, and she is the property ends up getting sold down to Louisiana after growing up as the owner's daughter. But just in that little part, touches on topics they wouldn't even thought of Gone with the Wind. You buy a children's slave, you wouldn't get that from Rhett Butler and Scarlet, would you? Bias is very important. Right? If you can isolate that bias, very good. If you can't, go back and try to isolate it because it is very important.
I don't know, it was so hard.
It is, and part of the problem with it is that you get exposed to like one book. When you read in your
And you side with them, so it's like you don't know.
You do. If they write well, that's the whole purpose.
Yeah.
Right? It's to convince you that the viewpoint is right. A lot of these people, particularly in more recent years, working in higher ed, they're probably going to have a fairly liberal political bias. If you go farther back, more likely to have a more conservative view. If you read more books, you get kind of familiar with it. You can kind of figure out that bias. Like Gun, Germs, and Steel basically blames the wealth of the rich nations on just because they were at a certain geographical location. Right? There's another book on the list, The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, that looks at is it institutions. If you look at that one, say a more conservative political leaning or more Western viewpoint. Europe is rich because they had capitalism. Other places, had monarchies and did not have free trade, and therefore didn't stimulate technology and so on and so forth. You really kind of have to, if you read both, you kind of would start recognizing the biases in both of them. If you only read one viewpoint, you have to struggle a little bit. But that struggle is worth it. Make sure you understand their bias. One of the points of this is that when you get to college, you're supposed to be developing this ability to think for yourself. It sounds pretty basic, but you have to think at a more advanced level. You should never take anything at face value. You should question everything. Why is this guy saying this? Is this true? Is it true that the only reason Europe is rich is because they had, the Gulf Stream and they had a warm climate and they could grow a lot of food there? Maybe that does explain a lot, maybe it doesn't. Probably the truth lies between the two viewpoints somewhere. But you should recognize where that guy is coming from as far as his political leanings or his social leanings. It could be that the person's writing a book from a Western European viewpoint. Let's see, Ms. Babican, you had one that was on Japanese history, so whether the guy really understands and writes from an Asian viewpoint would be much different than if they were writing from a Western Europeanized viewpoint. Particularly when you're examining social institutions, like is marriage different in China than it is here? Do they value children differently here as opposed to China? The answer is typically, yeah. Every society looks at those social institutions differently, and everybody who writes about some other cultures has a tendency to impose their value system on that other culture. When you get a totally different thing if you look at it through the spectrum of the value system of the society you're actually writing about. Doesn't specifically say it. I would think that this bias looks like it might be kind of anti-church, right? Anti-Catholic church in particular, from some of the quotes. And you don't have to come out and just say that if you can prove it strongly enough. Basically, that's what your authors are doing. They're trying to state their political position about something or their social position about something and state it forcefully enough that you don't even recognize it as a bias. You just say, so yeah, obviously, their geography impacted the development of civilizations more than anything else. I have some discussion of countervailing viewpoints in here. Talks about some of the other theories at the time of how the plague developed. Provides a pretty good summary. One thing you should notice here is that as they're summarizing this and mentioning what was actually in the book as far as the text, while they're doing that in those same paragraphs, they're talking about some critical aspect of that. Right? They're critiquing it. The part up here about Plymouth is wrapped into this discussion of his biases. So if you can do that, that can be very effective. Again, you don't have to do it that way. If you struggle with the format, you might want to just follow the checklist, but if you can do it, very good. This one mentions some of his use of details and supporting facts. Mentions his style of writing. Mentions that majority of readers will enjoy his techniques. It's a good comment. Notice it didn't say that he was providing any kind of new research. Didn't go to anything except really his writing style, that it's an enjoyable read. Right? Something important to put into a critique though? Yeah. You pick up a book and it's 900 pages long and you say you were falling asleep halfway through the first page. How valuable is that book? Probably not that valuable because you're not going to read it. I think there may have been a few missing elements in here. And again, not surprising when you're doing a rough draft. I would not expect everything to be in there because if you hadn't finished the book, it's kind of hard to do that. And even if you could put all the elements in there, you want to leave yourself a little space so you can come back and include stuff that you haven't looked at yet. Right. Once again, we've been through this, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but make sure you follow this. And, if I get time this week, I'll develop an actual checklist based on this so that you can go on and just put it right next to your computer screen and just literally check off each thing as you write it into there. But again, follow this because it tells you exactly what you need to do. Right here it tells you give the complete bibliography at the top in the CMS format. Again, the only deviance from that is that at the top you're going to have a full bibliography, full bibliographical entry, and then on that entry itself, last period you follow it by review by and put your name in there. You submit them through Angel, so I'm going to know. You don't have to say it's from my class. Obviously, I should know that when I get it. I don't think they're reviewing, Guns, Germans, and Steel in the psychology class. Also, since you've submitted in Angel, it's also going to go into your class. Angel, when you submit it, creates a folder with your name on it, so I don't really need all the other stuff. I know who it's from. I know what class it's for. Unless you're, for some reason, submitting it in the wrong Dropbox, I'll know what assignment it's for without looking at it. some reason you accidentally submit that one to the, I don't know, essay number 8 Dropbox, once I start reading it, I should also recognize what that actually is. If I don't, then you probably have some problems anyway. Okay. Make sure you pay attention to these things in bold print. Okay. They make them bold print because they want to stand out. They wanted to stand out because it's probably something pretty important. Like this one here, the main body of a critical book review will be concerned with thesis development. All right? And there were a few people who turned in basically long summaries. Right? Those people were doing a book report, not a book review. There is a difference in it. Make sure you have some analysis of the book and how well it supported its thesis and all that stuff. It's on, especially this list right here. First thing it says up there, identify the perspective, point of view, or purpose. Another way of phrasing that is isolate the person's bias, right? Isolate their prejudice. All right. It can go beyond, they may have a political leaning, but they also may have something in their career that affects how they write this. They may be focused on economics. If you look at economics in depth, you might not look at social aspects. Those things are important. Again, it might not mean that the book's is trash because it just focuses on economics, but you do want to make sure that the reader knows that. If a guy writes a book and he says the economic history of France, well, you don't expect a lot of social history in there. All right, is the book informed by religious or political ideology? Again, this kind of goes to the bias. Notice that there's some discussion of the sources on here. History of European witch trials based only on Inquisition records is one-sided. Any doubt of that? If you're looking at witchcraft and the only source you cite is something written by the church who's holding the trials and burning these people, that's going to impact how the guy writes the thing. It's going to show a certain bias as well. He is subdivided into all these, so make sure you get all these. All right, analyze his development of the thesis. Explain why he doesn't support his thesis. What's his purpose? And again, analyze why or why not he fulfills his purpose. Those two can be related, but they don't necessarily have to be. Does the author approach with biases? Examine all kinds of things there. His theological biases, philosophical. Does he have certain experiences that shape his biases? Cultural perspectives, so on and so forth. Again, it may be hard to isolate. Most likely you're going to run into something you're going to think it's either a political bias, a political leaning, or it's going to be something like he's analyzing a non-Western culture from a Western viewpoint. Right. Does the author properly support his thesis? Does he consider and refute opposing viewpoints? Some books don't do that. A lot of books don't do that. Right. But some of them, I think, Guns, Germs, and Steel's going to do that. Going to have a lot of argument that, or a lot of places where they mention, the prevailing view had been social institutions determined wealth, and he's placing it more on geographic considerations. Notice this one is actually, one letter, but there's a lot of stuff in there. D has, support of the thesis, consider opposing viewpoints. Is it limited in application? Is it relevant to contemporary culture? So you want to check off all of those as you write. And E, does he resort to suppressing contrary evidence? In other words, is he slanting the evidence in favor of himself? What other evidence would weaken his case? is procedure, right? Particularly for the ones that are doing some type of scientific analysis. Is there some flaw in the procedure? Right, that's obvious to you. Again, apply your common sense and be sure that you question everything. Does he prove his case, or should he have picked another thesis? And then your conclusion, discussion. Is it well organized and well written? Right, does the style recommended to a particular kind of reader? A final evaluation. How valuable is it? How important is it? What are the major strengths and weaknesses? Evaluated for readers who may be interested in this particular field of inquiry. Your primary purpose in this section is to respond both positively and negatively. So you should have something good to say about it and something bad to say about it. Every book's going to have some weaknesses, at the same time some strengths. You need to be able to make sure you recognize both of them. And like it says, it should be more in depth, and this is a good book everybody should read. Or it's a lousy book and nobody should read it. This kind of breaks that down. Who would you recommend it to? What are the strengths? What contributions in one? Secondly, why should a person read it? Third, what did you learn from it? Fourth, how might you apply this to contemporary society? 5, would you recommend it to other students, to laypersons? To whom would you recommend it, in other words? I'm trying to remember. I think it might actually be in your review, Ms. Babikin, where it says, I don't see where this would actually impact anyone who's not actually in this field, something to that effect. Try to look a little bit more in depth. Your book was on the sex trade in, what was it, ancient, medieval Japan. Again, you want to say who is actually going to be beneficial to, not just it's not beneficial to me, but maybe something diplomats might want to read. Right? Maybe people involved in human rights want to read. Right? It might have some impact on how they view sex in that society, or how they view women in the society in the present time. So it may have some other impact. Try to look for that impact. All right, the last thing, there were some grammatical errors and stuff like that that were also pretty common that you can negate by reading the guide. Very common, right here. Use the first person and second person sparingly. Probably don't want to refer to the first person at all if you can avoid it, but you can do it one or two places. Try not to get more than 2, maybe 3 mentions of yourself in there. I recommend this book. Can be reworded. This book is recommended for such and such readership. All right, very common. Avoid contractions in formal writing. Don't say don't. Say do not. Okay? The active voice, using that as much as possible. I'm not that worried about it. But do be clear and concise. Some people had some wordy sentences. The wordier your sentence gets, typically, the more difficult it's going to be for the reader to understand, or the more likely it is for them to read it with some other meaning than you intended. Use your spell check. Don't trust it though, especially if you have foreign names. Very unlikely that it'll catch those. If you use quotes, if it's using even perfect English. But the guy's from Oxford University, that means he's teaching in Oxford, England. They do spell things a little differently over there. A lot of things like favor, F-A-V-O-R, here is F-A-V-O-U-R over there.
Where's over there?
England. Okay, across the pond. All right, make sure you proofread. And then, of course, remember the page limit and requirements, so pay attention to the minimum and maximum on there. Note that if you put in notes in there, you do not get that to count for one of your pages, or the bibliography for that matter. One way we always used to do footnotes because you kind of got to cheat a little bit, because then it did add a little bit, and nobody was going to go through and figure out how much the footnotes actually took off your page count. Another thing that is very common is quotations. Generally, if you're separating quotation from other text, if the text comes before, you lead into it, and then you have the quotation in the middle of the sentence, you put a comma after the word, and then quotation mark, and start the quotation. Most people got that. But at the end, most people are putting in, or not most people, but a lot of people are putting in quotation mark at the end of the quote, and then the period outside the quotation. Make sure the quotation includes the punctuation. If the sentence that you're quoting ends in a period, technically it's part of the quotation. Right? If that is, not the end of the sentence in the quote, but it's the end of your sentence, then you should follow with the ellipsis, 3 periods, and that should be in the quotation mark. And then the superscript, or the number that tells you that that's your note, should be outside the quotation mark. So punctuation inside, then the quotation mark, then the superscript. That was very common. That's very common in a lot of the essays too. Sometimes I wonder if y'all read the comments I put back, because I note that a lot, and then the next time the same person do the same exact thing.
So where are your notes going to be? Where are your notes going to be?
They're always on the file that I submit back to. I might put some text in the box, but usually they're going to be in the document.
So it's going to be like at the bottom?
Yeah. Oh, man. Yeah, they're going to be just like this. This one did not actually have any. All right, but
Just red?
yeah, they're going to be read like that if it's a grammatical change. In this case, there weren't many, so I just made a few general comments at the bottom. But when you go back into the assignment, you can download those documents. Sometimes you'll find the comment boxes off to the side. Maybe that's why y'all haven't been making the same mistakes. Y'all know how to get the comments back? Everybody knows how? Okay. Everyone except Ms. Babbitt can do this?
Say!
So,
My problem's opening stuff up.
yeah, I think some of y'all, you're one of those, you use like something like OpenOffice or something like that?
No, I use Google Docs.
Google Docs, it might have a little difficulty
And so
translating.
if I don't like save it or download it, then I send it to you in like some weird thing. And it doesn't send.
Oh, yeah, that can create some problems. Everything I do is on Word, so when I download it, it converts it to Word, and probably saves it as Word too. It might try to save it back into Google Docs, but there may be some changes. So
Yeah,
if
I
you
can
have,
open
if you have
Word.
problems with the comments, let me know so we can.
I can open Word, just fine.
Yeah, I can. I
Send
mean,
me.
if the comments don't show, I can actually, save them as PDFs, so you can open that one too. But other than that, everybody's all right with opening the documents, seeing their reviews, hopefully seeing your reviews on the book reviews. And most of you, not too many changes in the document itself. A lot of times if you made an error and it was pretty consistent, like you use contractions, I would change it one time and make that notation. You might have had 50 others in there that I did not note or just changed without a comment, so figured you see it one time, you should pick up on that. Same thing with the quotes and some of those things that are redundant. You only see the change one time, so make sure that you go through and proofread. Yeah, I was reviewing them, but at the same time, like about 100 of these things coming at the same time. Y'all had like your midterm, so I wasn't gonna, my view is I don't want to do y'all's work for you. I want to kind of guide you, so, make sure you go back and proofread thoroughly before you submit it. Now, with that said, we do have that due date coming up pretty soon, so make sure you're on that. Got some essays also, but most of you should be able to finish a final draft within, say 2 hours maybe. Some people are just barely starting, so it looks like they have a lot more to do. If that's the case, make sure you devote some time to that and get a quality work in. If you did not submit a draft, obviously I can't make any comments on what you've done. So make sure that you follow the guide to the letter. Make sure that you follow the examples in the CMS guide to the letter, to the comma, and to the spacing after the punctuation marks. Because yes, I will take off and count that as incorrect if you have a comma and you follow that by 2 spaces, or if you put a period and only put 1 space after it. Period is followed by 2 spaces. A colon is also
What?
followed by 2 spaces.
What do you, hold on. At the end of the sentence, you're supposed to tap or click
Yeah,
click?
well, if it's the end of a sentence, it doesn't matter. But if you use
Oh.
like a period, like in the bibliographical entry, you have the last name, first name, period. There should be 2 spaces. You should hit the space bar twice. Same thing after a colon. Y'all are actually lucky. When I was in college, freshman year, they told us that we see more than like 5 grammatical errors. We're throwing your stuff in the trash. And that would include, grammar would include, spelling, punctuation, actual grammatical errors, or improper format. Just not even look at it after 5. So
Can't spell for nothing.
you obviously didn't know what you're doing, or slack in it. So y'all actually benefit from coming to school like 20 years later.
Did you use a typewriter too?
Yeah, actually, we did have to start out with typewriters. Yeah. Which is actually a change, because in high school that wasn't required, so we were supposed to be handwriting everything. When you got to college, you actually had to learn how to type or get someone to do it for you. It wasn't until like the year I graduated that really, computers really started getting accessible to everybody.
When was that? 1993?
Yep.
That's when I was born.
I have one more question.
Okay.
Did you have a notes page just at the bottom of these notes?
You can do one of 2 pages. The notes page, you can have it, but it doesn't count towards your page limit. Right? Only the text counts to it. So you can do an endnotes page.
Do we need a notes page in addition to footnotes?
No, if you do, it's one or the other in that case. Now,
Okay.
you do need a notes page and a bibliography if you go with the notes page. So the bibliography is different from the notes. It looks like it has the same information, but the bibliography is basically just a listing of all your sources. The notes page is showing every location, specific location in those sources. Bibliography has to be in order, alphabetical order, based on last name. The footnotes or the endnotes are in the order in which they occur. So whoever is, if you had 20 sources, source number 15 might be your first note, because the bibliography is just an easy reference for the person to go see where your sources are.
So our footnotes, they can repeat, right? I mean, it'll be the same note,
Good
but
question.
these are for a different thing, right?
Yeah, there's a short form on the note, right, which wasn't in the example. So, yeah, especially if you're using the book, right, you're going to have one of 2 things. If like you have note 1 is from the book, then you have some website sourcing the credentials, and then the next note is also from the book. All you have to do is put the author's last name, comma, page number. And that's it. Well, period after that. But that's all you have to do. You shorten it up a lot.
Okay.
If it's
Just I-
1, 2, 3 quotes in a row and they're all from the book, you don't even have to do that. Your first note is the full citation. If If you have one that comes right after that and it's from the same source, you just have to put IBID, capital I-B-I-D, period, comma, page number. Yeah, it's from some Latin word that means something like from what just came before or something like that.
Can you spell IBID again?
Yeah, I-B-I-D. But make sure that you capitalize the I. And I'll post those up somewhere too, or email them to everybody so that you know those. Does MLA have something like that? Or do you have to use like the author's name every time?
In the little parentheses, you use the same thing
Okay.
every time.
Yeah, Chicago's a little different. I don't know, let's see. Any of y'all going into like a legal field? Paralegal, maybe, okay, maybe. Y'all get to learn something called blue booking, which is even worse than CMS. And that's because, part of it's because the guys who create the style aren't even experts really, they're students at Harvard Law School. But you literally have a format for everything under the sun. And then you have to learn it all over again because if you go to a particular court, they have changes on it. So you have to learn a slightly different form of blue booking for that court. If you practice in more than one court, it might be 2 counties, different courts, so they might have different rules. So, learning formatting is crucial in some fields. If it's an academic field, you have to do it very precisely or you get those accusations of plagiarism. Obviously, you don't want that. If you go to some fields like law, well, you get your papers thrown out because you didn't do the proper formatting, and then somebody sues you for malpractice. So it can be important. All right, yes, ma'am.
What made you go from law to history?
Basically, when the recession hit, yeah, I kind of moved over to it, but now it's kind of like the law field, expectations financially have declined a lot, so there's really no point in moving back over. But originally, it got into teaching again because I was moving from the West Coast to East Coast, and I had a friend who was in an HR office, and I just needed a job to hold us over for a year. Just stayed in it. And like I said, the economy fell out, and the law field's not as profitable as it used to be.
I heard there's like a large surplus of lawyers.
Yeah, a lot of them got laid off and they're getting replaced with paralegals, which is why paralegals such a good field to go into now. At least for job security. Basically, paying those people like $40,000 to $50,000 for what they used to pay an attorney, $100,000 to $150,000. So they save money, so why not get rid of those guys? But anyway, that pretty much used up all our time, right? Okay, so we'll get into the Byzantines and to Western Europe next time. Crucial chapter, so make sure you stay up on top of that one. All right.